I still remember the day I walked into that wedding hall. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes. The air smelled of roses and expensive perfume, and music filled the room. But the moment I took my first step inside, everything froze. My own daughter, my blood, my child, I raised with these very hands, stood up and pointed at me. Her voice was sharp, cold, and loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "Dad, you're not invited. Go away." The laughter and chatter turned into whispers. Eyes pierced me from every direction. I stood there, clutching the small gift I had bought with the last of my savings. My heart thudded so hard it felt like it would tear my chest open. I tried to speak, but my lips trembled. I wanted to remind her of the nights I stayed awake when she was sick, the times I skipped meals so she could eat, the way I sacrificed every dream of mine just to build hers. But she didn't care. She looked at me like I was nothing but dirt beneath her shoes. I walked out of that wedding hall humiliated, crushed, and broken. But as I stepped into the cold night air, tears running down my wrinkled face, one thought repeated in my mind like fire. She will regret this. I wasn't born into wealth. My life was simple, maybe too simple, but it was filled with hard work and love. When my wife left us, I became both father and mother to my little girl. I still remember holding her tiny hand, promising myself I would never let her feel abandoned. I worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. In the mornings, I was a clerk, shuffling papers and earning barely enough. At night, I worked at a small shop, sweeping floors, carrying boxes, whatever it took. Sleep was a luxury I could rarely afford. Many nights I came home exhausted, my feet swollen, my back aching. But the moment I saw her little smile, running into my arms, the pain disappeared. She would press her cheek against mine and whisper, "Daddy, you're my hero." Those words kept me alive when my body begged me to give up. I skipped meals so she could eat. I patched my shoes again and again, but made sure hers were always new. I wore the same old shirt for years, while she always had clean dresses for school. Every sacrifice was worth it, because she was growing, learning, and shining. I remember the winter nights when our house was freezing. I wrapped her in my only warm blanket and stayed awake shivering just to keep her safe. On her birthdays, when I couldn't afford toys, I carved small wooden dolls with my own hands. She hugged them like treasures, and her laughter filled the house with warmth. There were hardships, yes. Loneliness ate at me when she was asleep, and silence echoed in the house. But I kept going because I told myself, one day she'll look back and know what her father did for her. I gave up my dreams, never traveled, never lived for myself. I poured everything into her education, her future, her happiness. I thought that if I gave her the world, she would always remember who gave it to her. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that love and sacrifice would be enough, that a father's devotion would never be forgotten. But I was wrong, so very wrong. I thought the worst had already happened when her mother left us. I never imagined my own child could do the same. It started slowly, like a tiny crack running along a wall I had trusted for years. At first it was small things. "Dad, don't bring that old coat next time," she'd say, almost embarrassed when I handed her a gift. I laughed it off, blamed the world, not her. I was foolish. One afternoon I heard her on the phone, laughing in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child. She says he's a good catch, but her father? I heard a voice say. "She's ashamed of him," she replied, and my name dropped from her mouth like a stone. I stood in the doorway, the words hitting me like a cold slap. Shock, pure, plunging shock, stole my breath. Then came the small edits to our routine. Visits became inconvenient, calls became shorter. "Dad, we're busy this weekend," she would say, and I learned to accept the distance while my heart shrank. One night I walked into the living room and found her arguing with her fiancé. I thought I would be invisible, until she saw me. She turned, and instead of the girl I raised, I saw someone smooth and practiced. You need to understand, she said, as if explaining a fact, not tearing out my insides. He can't know about your finances, about your debts. It's embarrassing. Embarrassing. The word landed and burned. Sadness rose like a tide. How could the man who carved toys from scraps, who pawned his watch for her tuition, be called embarrassing? I asked her once, softly, "Do you not want me there when you're happy?" She looked at me like I'd asked her to hand over her life. "Dad, you don't fit in anymore. Don't ruin this for me." Disbelief froze me. My mind kept asking, is this real? Is my little girl really standing there telling me I ruin things? Then the revelation that cleaved me in half. She'd been taking out small loans in my name. "Dad, sign this quickly," she'd said once, and I trusted her like always. I thought she needed help for school or rent. Turns out those signatures were for luxuries she'd bought to impress people who would never call me by my name. Greed had crept in, disguised as opportunity. I confronted her, my voice shaking, not from cold, but from a breaking heart. "You used my name?" I asked. "Why would you do that?" She shrugged, the motion clinical. "I needed help, Dad. Everyone has expenses. You always helped." Her casualness was a knife. Anger began to simmer under the ache. I begged her, begged like a man with nothing to lose. "If you ever needed me, tell me. Don't steal my name." Her answer was a laugh, sharp, cruel. "You don't understand our world, Dad. You'd complicate things." Humiliation poured over me like rain. I felt smaller than a child, embarrassed in my own life. The final blow came on the day I shouldn't have been surprised. I arrived at the wedding hall with a small wrapped gift and hope, a foolish, stubborn hope. She saw me, and the look she gave sliced clean through me. "Dad, you're not invited. Get out!" Her voice bounced off chandeliers and into the mouths of guests. For a moment, the world dipped into slow motion. Shock, then a cold, sinking emptiness. My knees wanted to buckle. The room spun. People stared, some with pity, some with barely concealed amusement. I stood there, hands empty and heart heavier than any weight I'd carried at work. Tears came, hot and unexpected. Sadness rolled into disbelief. How could she announce my erasure like that? Then disbelief hardened into fury, not the wild, instant rage you see in films, but a slow, burning anger that filled every silent corner of my chest. I felt abandoned by the child I had built my life for, betrayed by the daughter who now chose status over blood. Greed had become the language of her new life, desire, respect, its currency, humiliation, her tool. And as I walked away from that hall, each step was a stitch in the wound turning into something else, resolve. I didn't leave because I was defeated. I left because in that brokenness a new voice rose. She had thrown me out of her life. I would not be erased quietly. Every shocked glance behind me fed the ember of anger until it became a steady, controlled fire. That's when I knew I would make her choices face the daylight, whether she liked it or not. That night I sat on the edge of my bed, and the house felt enormous and hollow, like a room where echoes lived. The little gift I had wrapped lay on the table untouched, its paper neat, the ribbon still bright, a mocking little sun in the dim room. I held my head in my hands and let the sound of my own breathing be the only thing in the world. For hours, I replayed the wedding scene, frame by slow frame. Each look, each whisper seared into me. Grief came first, a cold, heavy thing that made my chest ache as if someone had tied a stone there. I kept remembering her small hands, the bedtime songs, the way she used to fall asleep on my shoulder. How foolish it felt to think that alone would be enough to protect me from being thrown away. Tears pooled, and I let them fall, not because I was weak, but because weight had to be released somehow. Then disbelief arrived again, sharp and bitter. How could she? I asked the empty room, though I already knew the answer. I had tried to buy her stability, to sell my comforts for her comforts, and she had traded me for a prettier story. The word embarrassing kept replaying, as if someone had stamped it across every memory I cherished. Anger came slowly, like a rising tide that first chills you and then rips at everything. It did not arrive as shouting or smashing. It was quieter, precise, cold, and focused. I thought about every time, as I swallowed my pride to give her more, the loans I worked off, the nights I lied awake counting unpaid bills. Each sacrifice had been a deposit in a bank I assumed she would draw from with gratitude, not with contempt. My hands trembled as I reached for the old photograph on the shelf, her in my lap, cake frosting on her nose, both of us laughing like there was nothing to fear. I pressed the paper to my heart and let the memory sharpen into clarity. I had been faithful to my promises, but my faith had become a trap. The grief that had softened into tears now folded into something else, a clear, burning resolve. I realized sorrow alone would not heal the wound. Action would. I thought about all the nights I'd told myself patience was a virtue, and that time would fix what had frayed between us. But patience had let her grow distant, and time had taught her new loyalties. If I waited more, the lies would settle like dust, invisible and permanent. No, waiting was consent. Silence was permission to forget me. So I sat very still and let the decision form, slowly but certainly. Enough is enough. Not a scream, not revenge for revenge's sake, but a promise to myself to reclaim my dignity and the truth. My monologue was quiet at first. You will show them who you are. You will not be erased. You will be seen. With each repetition, the words grew steady, a drumbeat in my chest. I mapped my anger into something useful. Memory became evidence. Pain became fuel. Humiliation became a lens to find the wrongs to right. I thought about the small betrayals, the loans taken in my name, the private lies, and I catalogued them in my mind like a ledger. I would not let their polished smiles hide the rot beneath. I would expose it, piece by patient piece. I took a breath and felt the air fill my lungs like a bellows. The loneliness that had once crushed me now sharpened my focus instead of blunting it. I would be careful, I told myself. I would be patient and precise. No needless cruelty, only truth and the consequence of truth. I would act with the same steady hands that had rocked her to sleep, the same patience that had taught her to tie her shoes. Before dawn crept in, I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the world continued, in different cars, distant lights, but inside me, a new day had begun. I placed my palm flat against the glass, as if pressing a hand to the future, and whispered, not wholly to myself, "You thought you could throw me away. You thought I would vanish. You were wrong." That whisper hardened into a vow that left no room for turning back. I will make sure she remembers me, not as a shadow to be stepped over, but as the man who taught her the cost of betrayal. I didn't become loud about it. Revenge, I learned, is not a shout. It's a careful whisper that grows into a storm. The first thing I did was sit down with a notebook and write everything I knew. Dates, names, bills, loans, conversations. I made a list of slights and lies, but also of places where truth might hide, ledgers, receipts, signed forms, small details she thought no one would notice. Then I started to collect those details like a man collecting heirloom seeds, quietly, patiently, one by one. I revisited old files from the clerk years, flipping through records with hands that still remembered the work. There were bank slips, signatures, application forms, small things that could be used to map a story. I visited the shop where I used to help at night. The owner owed me favor after all those years. He agreed discreetly to keep an eye out for anything that might help. I learned to use modern tools in a limited way. A burner phone for calls, an email address that no one would trace back to me. I didn't want to rush into accusations. I wanted proof so sharp it could not be ignored. So I began making quiet calls. An old colleague from the firm, a simpat, hectic clerk at the registrar, a teacher who still remembered my daughter's scholarships. Each conversation was a test, each memory a possible thread. Some leads were dead ends, others opened small doors. An ex-client of mine, who had once been wronged by the same family, offered to show me paperwork if I could meet him at the cafe on Park Street. We met, and he slid an envelope across the table. Photocopies of invoices, notes of payments that didn't add up. I recruited allies the way a farmer recruits hands for harvest, people who had reasons to be discreet and had nothing to gain from lies. There was Mrs. Khan from the laundromat, who had seen my daughter sign strange documents, a retired bank teller who remembered certain transactions, a young journalist I had once bumped into who owed me for a favor. I paid in small kindnesses, a free meal, a patch for a broken roof, a cup of tea, and a listening ear. People remembered kindness, and kindness bought discretion. I learned patience. I watched their movements from a distance, when they traveled, who visited the house, which numbers called late at night. I planted small seeds of doubt in the right places, anonymous notes, casual questions from a neighbor who happened to overhear, a stray photograph that accidentally fell into the wrong hands. I tested which truths would unsettle them, and which would be dismissed as gossip. I kept refining. Not everything I planned was clever or grand. Some of it was petty and precise. I made sure their bills were looked at. I nudged a creditor to check a file twice. I used paperwork against pride. The very forms that claimed their legitimacy were full of the fingerprints of their lies. But I also kept a moral line. I was not out for ruin's sake. I wanted the truth seen and the consequences to land where they belonged. There were nights I slept with my notebook under my pillow, dreaming of ways to stitch the fragments into a whole. There were mornings I sipped weak tea and rehearsed conversations in my head, imagining how to slip a single fact into the right ear. I kept one crucial element hidden even from my closest allies: the final move. Some things a man must keep to himself until the moment the curtain lifts. Sometimes I would allow myself a small, almost childlike joy, finding one more receipt, hearing an incriminating phrase in a neighbor's passing remark. Each small victory was a stitch in the fabric I was weaving. People started to call me less pitifully and more respectfully, as if they could sense the shift in my spine. They began to wonder, quietly, in their own shops and corners, what the old man was up to. Now, with files copied, allies in place, and the first domino nudged, the plan moved from paper into motion. I could feel the air change, the hush before a storm has its own scent. I would not reveal everything here, not yet. Curiosity is part of the justice I intended to serve. But I will say this: patience has been my weapon, secrecy my shield, and truth my blade. When the first crack appears, it will not be accidental. It will be placed with the same steady hand that taught her to walk. And in that quiet, precise moment, everything I have gathered will be set down like a lantern in a dark room. They will look for a switch and find only light. They will ask, "Who did this?" And I will answer with the simplest truth I can give: I did. I made my first move quietly, like a surgeon making an incision. An envelope arrived on the desk of a small investigative reporter I'd met at a tea stall. Photocopies, dates, names, the kind of paper trail accountants hate. She read it once, twice, and then her eyes sharpened. "If half of this is true," she said, "they'll crumble." I didn't sign my name. I only watched from across the street as she started asking questions. The second move was a nudge to a creditor who'd never been paid properly. I called, old favors still open doors, and suggested they recheck files tied to my daughter's in-laws. They did. Numbers didn't add up the way a man who loves neat ledgers expects them to. A small audit request turned into something bigger. Someone with power smelled blood. At a holiday dinner meant to celebrate the couple, I sent a single text from an anonymous number to a relative abroad. "Check the property deeds." That cousin, curious and a little greedy, forwarded the note to a family member who happened to work in legal services. Within days, a lawyer with a severe suit and cleaner hands asked uncomfortable questions. Their polite smiles began to crack. I arranged for the laundromat woman to keep an old receipt she'd found months ago, the one with my daughter's signature and a different name beside it. She handed it over to the journalist. The reporter put it into a story that landed on the morning paper like a stone in still water. Phone calls started, whispers in the mosque. The family's housekeeper called in sick for a week and then disappeared. People noticed. Then came the twist I hadn't expected but had prepared for. The fiancé turned on his family. He'd been sitting on his own conscience, or perhaps on his own fear of losing everything. Facing a raid and threats to his business, he began to talk. At first privately, then in sworn statements. He revealed transfers, shell companies, payments hidden behind charitable names. His betrayal of his own blood tasted bitter, but it widened the crack until it became an earthquake. I remember the night the police came. Blue lights threw shadows over their marble floors like ink spilling into a clean page. Men in plain clothes carried boxes. Women in suits questioned the driver who used to ferry them to board meetings. Assets were frozen, accounts withheld. A family that had once sneered at me now watched officers take their records away. My daughter called me that evening, her voice small, ragged. "Dad, this is a mistake. Help me." I could hear the hell she'd chosen closing, like a door. I didn't run to her. I didn't rush. I let the silence do its work. Truth, when it lands, does not need shouting. It echoes. At a press conference, the reporter laid out the story in plain sentences. Photos, bank names, dates. I sat at the back, an old man with tired hands. People craned their necks. Some remembered the man who had carved toys in his tiny shop. Others only saw the scandal. The city's comment sections filled with anger, then pity, then outrage. The in-laws' reputations sank. Sponsors pulled support. Partners severed ties. Another surprise, a former business partner who had once been nearly ruined by them, came forward with audio of conversations. He had kept it, waiting for the right moment. Hearing their own words recorded, cold, transactional, without the polish of smiles, was like watching a mask fall. The public watched the collapse in real time. When the tax inspector arrived at the mansion, my daughter stood in the doorway in a nightgown, hair uncombed, pleading with a man who had once promised to protect her. "You need to tell them everything," the inspector said. "We have more than suspicion now." Her confession came out in bits, first to save herself, then because there was nowhere left to hide. Each admission fell like rain on the fire she had started. They tried to spin. Lawyers drafted statements. Statements turned into denials, then into partial admissions. But paper is honest when people are not. Witnesses I had quietly coaxed to speak did so under oath. Small shopkeepers, drivers, accountants, people who had been ignored, suddenly mattered. The court filings were sterile and terrifying, but they were true. The last scene came at a small family gathering that had been hastily called. The in-laws' patriarch, once powerful, sat hunched and diminished. He looked at Maz, a daughter, with something that could almost have been pity. "You brought this on us," he whispered. Her knees buckled. She grabbed at him and asked for forgiveness, first from him, then from God, then, in a voice that cracked, from me. I walked into that room not to gloat, but because I wanted to see the end with my own eyes. She looked up at me, not with the defiant glare of the wedding day, but with a child's face collapsed under the weight of consequence. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm sorry." No sound came from me for a long moment. Regret is a private thing. Justice, once done, is public. They were punished in ways that matched their crimes, fines that hit where it mattered, public exposure that stripped away their comfortable masks, legal consequences that altered their futures. They lost money, yes, but they also lost the lazy security of belief that wealth could erase truth. I watched as headlines replaced their smiles. I watched as people who once bowed now avoided their gaze. But the most satisfying moment wasn't the arrests or the freezing of accounts. It was the small, quiet scene after the storm. My daughter, sitting on the steps of the same house where she had once laughed, holding the carved wooden doll I had made her years ago. She had cleaned it, mended a missing arm. She was different, not humbled in the theatrical sense, but painfully, humanly diminished, and perhaps learning. I didn't dance on ruins. I didn't shout victory. I simply closed my notebook and walked away. I had wanted truth to have its day. It did. The betrayers were exposed. They were punished according to the law and the court of public opinion. And as I walked into the quiet of my own small home, I felt something settle. Not joy, not triumph, but the steady calm of a man who had stood up for himself and for the honesty he had always tried to teach. The last twist, one I hadn't planned for, came months later when the fiancé, having lost everything, wrote me a short letter. He admitted his part, but what surprised me was his one line. "You were kinder than I deserved." I folded that paper and put it in my drawer. It was small, but it was a kind of acknowledgement I had wanted more than their ruin. In the end, it wasn't about ruining lives for pleasure. It was about setting right what had been twisted. Lies called truth, greed called ambition, and a father's name used as a stepping stone. They paid the price. I got back my name, and though the wound would never fully vanish, the scar would remind me, and them, that some things cannot be bought or replaced. When the storm finally passed, I found myself sitting in the quiet of my small house, the same place I had returned to night after night through years of struggle. No more phone calls from journalists, no more whispers in the marketplace. The city had moved on to newer scandals, but I sat with silence. At first I thought victory would taste sweet, that when justice struck them down, I would feel whole again. But the truth? It was more complicated. My heart was a battlefield where peace and sorrow lived side by side. Yes, I felt a deep calm knowing the truth had been seen, that lies had been shattered. But I also felt grief for the daughter who once held my hand at the fair, who begged me for toys I carved at midnight, who once whispered, "Dad, don't ever leave me." Somewhere along the road, that little girl had been lost. And though I had punished the betrayers, I could not bring her innocence back. One evening, she came to me quietly. No reporters, no audience, no in-laws, just her. She looked older, as if months of disgrace had aged her years. Her eyes were swollen with tears that wouldn't stop falling. "Dad," she said, "I destroyed everything. I destroyed us. Can you ever forgive me?" I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness isn't a coin you can hand over like payment. It takes time, wounds, scars, and reflection. But I let her sit beside me, and for the first time in years, we didn't argue. We didn't blame. We just sat in silence. That silence, to me, was worth more than any revenge. It was the beginning of something fragile, something new. Life after revenge is strange. You expect fire, but what you find is ash. And in the ash, you must decide whether to rebuild or let it stay barren. I chose to rebuild, slowly. Not for her, not for them, but for me. I started walking again in the mornings, greeting neighbors who had once pitied me. I reopened my workshop, carving little wooden figures for children, their laughter-filled spaces that had once been heavy with anger. I learned that revenge may win you justice, but only forgiveness wins you peace. Still, I won't lie. I never forget. Scars don't vanish, but they remind you of who you are, of what you endured, and of what you will never allow again. And so, here is the lesson I leave with you. Family can be your greatest strength or your deepest wound. Love them, but never blind yourself. Sacrifice freely, but do not let yourself be erased. For in the end, respect is the foundation of every bond, and without it, even blood becomes poison. My daughter learned too late that betrayal has a cost. I learned that revenge has a weight. But together, perhaps, we may learn that redemption is still possible if we are willing to face the truth. So, if you remember nothing else from my story, remember this. Never trade your dignity for anyone's approval. Love deeply, but stand firmly. Forgive when you can and when you can't. Let justice do the talking, because peace doesn't come from winning or losing. Peace comes the moment you refuse to be broken.